Welcome to part 4 of a series that we're doing here at the Alembic Files. That series being titled Once Upon a Time, relating directly to the fact that what we've been fed about the origins of this country and some of its actions, if not all, have been pretty much been a myth, a fairy tale, and we're just saying why. So, once again, I'm Al.
I'm Theo.
And I'm going to start off this time. I had promised last time out, much to everyone's chagrin, I'm sure, that I was going to read something from a book entitled Sources of the Constitution. The link was up there from the last time around. Maybe you've gone there already. What I'm going to read is from Chapter 2. This book was written by a Brit. I believe it was, 1894. I don't have that exactly in front of me.
I think that was the year.
All right.
Sounds right.
Yeah, I guess these things, I should just go ahead and do it, right?
Well, the late 1800s are an interesting time in history.
Yes, they are.
The number of books you and I come across that are out of print that tell roughly the same story are phenomenal. They all come from between 1850 and 1900.
Yeah, this is 1894, and the reason why I believe that makes sense, what you just said, was I believe that there was a changing of the guard. We've referred to this already, and that is after the Brits got a pretty good bloody nose in the Boer War. And this is from Cecil Rhodes' own mouth, and that is they no longer had, they could no longer fight the wars. Their best blood could no longer fight the wars. So they realized they needed some help. I mean, it is that tiny island, whatever that thing is from Shakespeare, that blessed turf or whatever. But I mean, obviously the world was getting bigger, so to speak. And their population wasn't rendering all that much to keep up with, shall we say, the expansion. So after the Boer War, it seemed to be quite clear that the United States stepped in as a military force at about the time the Brits were kind of just pulling it back a little bit. Not that they weren't an effective fighting force, it's just that they needed some help. Let's just put it that way. Otherwise, we would not have been in World War I and II. So at that time, we get into the Spanish-American War, which I think was just a rehearsal. I mean, that was a lopsided debacle. And this is all because Cuba's people were being oppressed by the Spaniards. And I'm thinking to myself, so what changed? It's Fidel now, but we don't seem to want to go in there.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting that we never took that as part of the prize. We let Cuba stay, obviously, quote, independent, whatever that meant, and took Puerto Rico and the Philippines, but didn't touch Cuba. That's for another year.
Yes, and even down to today, you see peculiar things like, Hugo Chavez? Where does he go for treatment for, what does he have, cancer? He goes to Cuba. Just little interesting things like that. What, does he not trust the doctors in his own country? Why does he got to go to Cuba?
Ask the Pope. He's there more than anybody else is.
Well, exactly. Now you're getting to
right.
pulling the strings there.
So after the Spanish-American War, I believe there was a changing of the guard. And, of course, our military was subject to what Britain and other certain power centers in Europe wished. And so, yeah, and that all seemed to take place at that time. Plus, if you go another 5 or 10 years beyond 94, you've got a lot of interesting works coming out of the City of London, to include Halford Mackinder's thesis about what would constitute the final empire, where would that war be fought. You have Robert U. Benson writing the futuristic work, Lord of the World. So something was going on there, without a doubt. And Cecil Rhodes, I guess, was at the end of his rope at that time, and had made the round table, which I believe, after his passing, and the setting up of all the trusts that he had, was overseen by Lord Milner and his, what you call the kindergarten group. Pretty interesting stuff. You said it. So here we are again in this time period. And this book is called Sources of the Constitution of the United States, considered in relation to colonial and English history by C. Ellis Stevens. That book can still be had. It's very scarce out there. I don't know why you would want to necessarily avail yourself of that unless you have untold wealth. but you can read it here online. And this is from Chapter 2. This refers to what I think Americans overlook with a certain verb that's used in relation to the Constitution, that the founding fathers, the framers, adopted the Constitution. The word adopted is always used with the Constitution. But people don't think about what that means. Adopted obviously means you are taking something that was not yours to begin with. All right, and I'll just pick it up here in Chapter 2. Sir Henry Maine touches the same point, and this is a quote. The Constitution of the United States is colored throughout by political ideas of British origin, and it is in reality a version of the British Constitution as it must have presented itself to an observer in the second half of the last century. The last century would obviously be the 1700s. And again, a quote. The Constitution of the United States is a modified version of the British Constitution, but the British Constitution which served as its original was that which was in existence between 1760 and 1787. The modifications introduced were those and those only which were suggested by the new circumstances of the American colonies now become independent. I don't know that I'm not trying to cherry pick as I go through this. I don't know if I want to continue reading everything, but this is at the end of Chapter 2 of that book. And let me just skip around. All right, we deal with the fact that not much was said to this very day, that the Constitution was borrowed heavily upon the British Constitution. Everybody thinks that those framers went down here and knocked out a document in 3 days. They did not do that, not from scratch. So this silence, this individual, Sir Henry Maine, speaks about in this paragraph. Maine refers to this remarkable silence, especially as affecting the pages of the Federalist, and ventures an explanation. There is one fountain of political experience upon which the Federalist seldom draws, and that is the political experience of Great Britain. The scantiness of these references is at first sight inexplicable. The writers must have understood Great Britain better than any other country except their own. They had been British subjects during most of their lives. They had scarcely yet ceased to breathe the atmosphere of the British Parliament and to draw the strength from its characteristic disturbances, which we're all familiar with. Then it skips. It says, on the whole, it cannot be suspected that the fewness of the appeals to British historical examples had its cause in their unpopularity. The object of Madison, Hamilton, and Jay was to persuade their countrymen, and the appeal to British experience would only have provoked prejudice and repulsion. So it's my understanding in that last line. Let's just hear that one more time, right? Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, their object was to persuade their countrymen, and the appeal to British experience would only have provoked prejudice and repulsion. In other words, if the new citizens of the several states, now known as the United States of America, realized that their Constitution was based heavily upon the Brits, they would not be happy people. You have any take on that from what you've heard so far?
No, it's just completely in concurrence with what Montgomery writes. And also, speaking of Hamilton, I'll give you a quote that I'm looking at that's kind of related from Montgomery. First, he starts off talking about why we had to have the National Bank. This is, of course, linked to that. And France knew it was coming, and France made sure that when they loaned the United States money that they had their guarantee. And even in the loaning, through the House of Rothschilds located in France, there was kind of a competition as to who was going to exact more taxes, more usury from the New World, the new United States, whether it be France or England. But anyway, speaking of the National Bank, Montgomery writes, this is the foothold Hamilton had over Washington during the debate on whether or not to allow the banking families to incorporate in the U.S. and float this country's debt. And then, a couple of sentences later, Montgomery writes, the king always intended to retain his minerals and money. And now here is the line that really links it to what I think you just read. He says, and the king knew that his barristers would retain his land under the corporate trust. The king put it in charge of some very select, probably high-degree Freemason barristers. In other words, lawyers. It was a backdoor deal between lawyers, secret societal lawyers, that exacted this deal, and they borrowed it, as you just indicated, from the British Constitution.
Yeah, and I'll seal it up with this. Again, we're not cherry picking, but it's all there to be read if you so wish to. It says a distinction is important to remember, that the American Constitution, though reflecting a contemporaneous stage, was not a mere imitation of the Constitution of the motherland, but a historical development from it. Its similarity to its prototype resulted not from any copying process first undertaken in the convention at Philadelphia. Now, that doesn't mean there wasn't a copying process. It just stated that it didn't result alone from whatever copying process was undertaken at the convention. That's what we're saying. I mean, obviously, if you're going to borrow, you're going to copy from it. But they're saying this wasn't necessarily just a straight template job.
Yeah.
Moving on, it says, rather was a reaffirmation of principles already American by hereditary usage or long-established custom. The earliest attempt at a national constitution, that of the Confederation, had been a failure precisely as to the points in which it departed from these principles. And the present Constitution was a return to a system from which the colonies themselves had never departed. Hamilton, Madison, Jay, and others had no need to argue for the adoption of English constitutional usage as such to a people who were already accustomed to it from their own, acquired habit. Even the members of the convention, though consciously taking much from the old system, were doubtless incompletely aware of the extent to which they themselves were influenced by their training under such institutions. And then finally, the establishment of a permanent constitution of any other than an English character would probably have been an impossibility. This is sufficient to account for relative silence as to sources at the time and ever since. Americans then regarded and still regard their constitutional principles as essentially their own, English constitutional principles having become American constitutional principles. The long and short of it is, we got an English Constitution. Deal with it. And Yeah, and I mean, our law is based pretty much on English law as well. So it's not really that big an aha. But we are led to believe that this Constitution was 100% new, borrowed from nothing, and it all came out of the heads of the framers in 3 days down in Philadelphia.
Yeah, how about these patriot idiots today who say bring back the Constitution, and they typically point to things, and rightfully so, but they point to things like the Patriot Act, the American version of the Enabling Act, and they say how fraudulent it was that it's claimed the Patriot Act was written in a few days. And they're right, but they don't realize that their beloved Constitution, the same trick was played with that. It wasn't written in a few days. No. It was borrowed. They had it ready all along in the British form earlier on.
I would trust this anecdote from a person I had dealings with for quite some time. He worked or still works for I don't want to say too much about it. I'll just say he works for a firm in Chicago, quite well known in its field. And he had said that in the mid-'90s, they had a number of personnel from the Rand Corporation in-house. And he remembers them openly talking about the fact that they had drafted the Patriot Act.
Oh, wow.
And the Rand Corporation is a very interesting think tank. That's another thing. How many think tanks, foundations do we need in the United States? I mean, I cannot believe every time something comes out about a poll or something, or a white paper or a position paper, I never come to an end of hearing about new foundations, and it's like, who pays these people? Who are these people? You know, it's just amazing to me. You know, it's like the foundation for the almost all right and the foundation for the hard to believe. You know, jeez.
Seems like they're just another form of semi-secret society.
Well, you got to wonder what their purpose is. Are part of them just kind of like vestigial pimples on the butt of America? Or are they, I mean, there's no doubt Rockefeller Foundation has done quite a bit, and Carnegie as well, and Ford. But some of these other, like the Hudson Group or whatever. It's
Hoover, Brookings Institute, all
Hoover,
of them.
Brookings, and other two big ones, yeah. University of Chicago, there you go.
And what do when you think about it, they're like Hollywood movie producers. In the end of the day, what do they produce? Nothing. They don't produce any food. They don't produce any power. They don't produce, actually, they don't fix anything. Well, they produce paper.
Well, they may do something that's even more important, but less...
words on paper.
Well, I was going to say less tangible to people because it is a psychological manipulation. They may create attitudes. They may create certain memes that are out there that help with the whole shaping of wherever this country is going, and it certainly isn't good.
Yeah.
And there may be some that, well, I mean, there may be some that are very well-meaning, but I have a, you know, at the end of the day, why do we need you? I mean, what was government supposed to do? So,
exactly, yeah.
All right. So there's the story about the adoption of the Constitution, and it wasn't just an original docu from the framers. Now, the other thing is they whack the Articles of Confederation. Now, I'm not saying those things were perfect. I'm not saying they should have lasted forever. No problem there. The problem I have is that these unelected individuals went down to Philadelphia to decide probably the most critical element in the formation and continuation of this country.
And they lied.
And they lied. They did it under the auspices of tweaking the articles, and they came out and they threw the articles in the gutter. And that is what ticked off a lot of the former colonists, especially those who had fought to get away from what they were now being presented with, a crap sandwich that they try to avoid because that's what they had, or their daddies and mommies had in England.
When you got to meet in secret like that, it's not a good thing.
No. No, it isn't. So, but of course now it's interesting too because in the era now of terrorism, everything the government does, it does in secret or behind closed doors, or it's top secret because, well, you know, it's national security. Everything's national security. You know, the price of corn is national security.
Sure, yeah.
So, all right, there's now I'm going to throw it to you because you also had some salient quotes about not only the Constitution but some of the characters that were involved in it.
I kind of am loaded for bear with a bunch of Montgomery quotes here. First of all, Al, before I get into the quotes from Montgomery, the facts that Montgomery cites, I wanted to start it off today with some conjectures of my own about the American Revolution, things that people need to think about historically, and they don't because they've been brainwashed, really. And the American Revolution itself, the war, while of course for the common man fighting it, risking his life, it was real. The fighting was real. But at the higher level, I'm convinced that some of the generals, the higher you go, the more the thing was rigged, the fix was in, especially in the later stages of the war. And let me start it off with this specifically. I remember years ago watching a documentary about the American Revolution, and the narrator was talking about the British General Cornwallis, and there was some mystification over why Cornwallis didn't seem to prosecute the war with the same vigor that he seemed to show in his other military career. The fact is, Cornwallis never lost a battle before the American Revolution. He never lost a battle after the American Revolution. It was only strangely during that American Revolution when Cornwallis somehow weirdly lost his mojo. But the narrator on this documentary, like on PBS, I think it was. He was noting how during the winter months, and sometimes not even in the winter months, how Cornwallis spent a lot of time going to ballroom dancing and dancing with the belles and dames, the aristocratic colonists' women, spending a lot of time with them instead of prosecuting the war, and it just was uncharacteristic of him. Now, as Montgomery notes here, when Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, Cornwallis did not surrender the war. He surrendered a battle. He did not surrender the war, as we are taught. But if you look at Cornwallis's career, what happened to him after Yorktown? Historically, and I can't think of any exception to this, maybe somebody else out there can, but when a general, no matter how renowned he is, when a general loses a battle as climactic, as important as Yorktown was, I mean, Cornwallis supposedly lost the whole war at Yorktown. And when that happens, historically, a general gets demoted. I mean, he's lucky if he isn't drummed out altogether, but he always, such a general will always be demoted. So what happens with Cornwallis after the Revolution, when he goes back to Britain, guess what? He gets promoted. He got promoted to the military rule. He was the military head over all of India, over the British colonial holdings in India. Now, if the American Revolution, as it happened, as we were taught, if that was legit, there's no way that King George is going to entrust Cornwallis to go and lose India just like he supposedly lost America. No. But he did it. King George gave the military control over India to Cornwallis. And, well, guess what Cornwallis did in India? He resumed his butt-kicking ways and never lost another battle. See, there's something fishy, highly suspicious about the way Cornwallis comported himself during the American Revolution. And if you think about two more things about this, my conjectures, and I'll get back to Montgomery. If you study history, but the history of wars between France and England, name one time when France defeated England at anything, especially at sea. I mean, not even Napoleon could beat Britain. That just didn't happen. And yet we are taught that Admiral de Grasse's French fleet just happened in the nick of time to arrive at Yorktown to bottle up Cornwallis's troops. Baloney. I mean, first, the timing is suspicious. The fact that it's the only time in history we can point to the French Navy doing anything to defeat the British is suspicious again. All right? And then the final thing I will say, as much for my own conjectures. Who did Washington defeat at, what was it, Saratoga? So Washington's main, when he crossed the Potomac and gained his victory then, what forces did he defeat? Did he defeat British troops? No.
Wait, hold on a second. You got two things going on here.
Yeah.
Are we talking about Saratoga?
Yeah.
All right, let's remember that's
shifting battles, but okay, here's what I'm getting at. Many of the troops over here, as we remember, many of the British troops over here were not British. They were Hessians. They were foreign mercenaries. Now, if the American colonies were so important to Britain, which they were, then why in the world, and if the fighting was legit, and Britain really wanted to win this war, why in the world would Britain trust their victory to foreign troops rather than British troops? That's another suspicious thing. It seems to me that the upper echelon of Britain knew that the fix was in, but they had to put on the show that the fighting was real, and that there really was victory intended. And so they said, let's let the foreigners die? Why let our own guys die? Let's save them for the time when we really win the war. That's what's going on. Now, before I get to Montgomery stuff, you want any comment on that?
Well,
those are just off the top of my head.
I think we have to put ourselves in a different frame of mind, again, from what we have been brought up with, because you have people over here. I mean, most of the sentiment was not to go to war against Britain. So you have, obviously, you might have the old, fathers and sons and brothers and at odds about whether or not to join the revolution, to have a revolution. So you've got that going on, and everybody's kind of familiar with how small a percentage of, we'll just call them Americans, were willing to get entangled in the revolution. Okay, so you got that going on. It's really blood against blood. It's it's not like this whole nation was scrubbed clean of British influence, culture, politically, whatever. The other thing is that a lot of the major officers were Brother Masons.
Yes.
And I mean, it's been stated. At this time, I could not prove it with documentation, although I'm sure it's out there, at least enough that this has been floated past my eyes. And that is, I wouldn't be surprised if, in fact, if two of them got together and said, look, we don't have to do this duke out. We can just walk on by. You go on that side of the hedge, we'll go on this side of the hedge, and we never saw each other. I'm sure that took place. I'm not saying it's a bad thing either. I mean, you take a look, and one of the criticisms, I don't know if that's the right word for it, but one of the speculations or suspicions or whatever you want to call it, was the absence of numerous major battles for a war that took place, 9 years?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not trying to downgrade that. It's just a fact. I mean, let's take a look at the reality of the revolution, and let's remember also, now you said they threw the Hessians over here. That's because the Brits were still entangled with intrigues on the European continent, France up front and center. So they kept, they kept their best for the fight closest to home, and took the Beretta soldiers and sent them over to the United States. So, yeah, there wasn't as much, I guess, of a natural desire for rental troops to fight as if they were the Crown's troops. Of course, those who fought here for the United States, that's a different deal. I mean, this is my home, and I'm fighting with tooth and nail. And there you have it also. You have a driven people who had nowhere else to go, backs against the wall. This is it. That fighting with that kind of resolve versus rental troops. So take that, take the Masonic situation, take the fact that we were still very much British, and you've got a war that's probably pretty unpopular and an antagonism to everybody. And so what did Britain do? They said, look, forget this, all right? And they went for the juggler. They were smart. They went for the money. Why fight this out when we can grab them on the pipeline?
Yeah.
All right, thank you for that, and it's back to you.
No better way to conduct such a secret society than have the leaders be in the same secret society and having taken sworn blood oaths of secrecy, and they can never tell what they've done, and they cut the deal. There can never be any real justice in a nation when you have secret societies. There never can.
You silly boy. That's the way of the world. That's why you don't have any worthwhile governments.
Yeah. Let me start with this Montgomery quote. He makes an excellent point here. All right. Talking about how if the king, even if King George wanted to give away his colony in 1783 at the Peace Treaty of Paris, he could not have. All right, here we go. No matter how it happens, Montgomery writes, the only way to change the corporate grantor, the corporation's soul, is for the king to be conquered or die. It would also be necessary for him to not have any heirs or successors. The king's charters and grants are forever, unless the king and his heirs and successors come to an end, one way or another. The crown, the heirs, and successors are today alive and well. Therefore, their charters and grants that were not affected by the 1783 peace treaty are still in full force and effect. The only way the Americans could have really gained their independence would have been to invade Britain and kill the king and all of his heirs. That's it. That's the only way it could have been done. The king, and Montgomery goes into this elsewhere, because of the British law, the ancient law of mortmain, King George III did not even have the power to cede independence, true independence, to the United States. It never happened. It couldn't have happened. Okay, and so there we come to this by Montgomery, and this is why when you read the 1783 peace treaty, in which the supposed ruler, the Treaty of Paris, in which the supposed loser, King George III, dictated the terms. This is why, if you read closely, King George granted his subjects, his former subjects, he granted them independence, but he didn't give them certain things. He didn't give away, for example, the land. He didn't give away any mineral rights. All right, this is another part. This is from the beginning of the chapter called Common Law versus Conquest, from the book America, or the United States is Still a British Colony by James Montgomery. This is chapter 5. He writes, and some of this I think he's drawing from Lysander Spooner as well. The forefathers that represented the states or colonies at the beginning of this country acted primarily for their interest, their own interest. This is brought out by Lysander Spooner in his paper, The Constitution of No Authority. The 1783 peace treaty ceded the land above ground to the states while reserving, through Article 6 of the 1783 treaty, his corporation. It kept the corporation, and it kept the corporations of his British subjects. If you will look at other charters, you will see, it's talking about, I think, the earlier state charters, or, I don't know which charters, put it that way. But Montgomery writes, if you will look at other charters that the king signed off on, you will see the king is very specific when he gives land by grant or charter to his subjects. Oh, I know what he's talking about. That would be when the king would give certain plots of land to certain noblemen, certain grants of land. Okay. Continuing with Montgomery. If the king had meant to give the minerals to the states, he would have said so very clearly in the 1783 peace treaty. The 1783 peace treaty is void of any such grant. The king did not relinquish his claim for his heirs and successors, nor could he. His tax was to continue forever, for his expenditure, together with what after the Civil War, the king's interest continued to be observed and a tax collected. Again, so the fix was in. The Americans never gained any independence.
Well, just enough to make them think they were independent. That's all that matters.
Well, they didn't gain any property rights. They were cut loose. Sure, you can do what you want, but I'm keeping the land, is what the king evidently said.
There is a whole interesting chapter that I just touched upon in years gone by. First with an individual by the name of David Wilbur Johnson, and secondly with a family out of Georgia, the Rice family.
Oh, yeah.
Well, Johnson went back into... He was somebody that was brought on as a, I don't want to say counsel in the legal sense, but somebody who was very versed in property rights. Some of the things that he shared with me when I did an interview with him years ago, and I think I have a couple of documents that he had sent me during that time. You go back to check things out. I mean, they go back right to the very first transaction, which in the Northeast, for instance, as he gave one of the examples, in New Rochelle, New York, in fact, what is now New Rochelle, they went back to the original sale, quote, sale, whatever that meant, between the native peoples and the Dutch. And what happened was, in going back to that original transaction, and again, like I said, this is way too labyrinthine to get involved with here, but because of what they found in that documentation, it actually prevented the building of a super mall in New Rochelle, New York, in the 20th century. The Rice family got involved with a property squabble, and this happens, well, it usually only happens in deed-restricted communities, as one of which they lived. And they got back to like dealing with paperwork and plots and all this stuff going back to the time of the Clays, the original Clay family. So descendants of which were in Georgia. I mean, it's crazy. And then they got somebody came in that was involved, and I'm telling you, I know this is scattered, but this is how crazy it is. They got involved with somebody there that was an emissary from the Netherlands. It was nuts. Let's not forget the Dutch were here too, right? But that's how strong that is. I mean, that's probably the most steel-like observed law that there is, and that is the land transactions and who owns what. So this whole deal about Britain, I mean, like I said, we never bought the land that were the 13 colonies from Britain. We never won it in the war. So exactly who owns this? And of course, you remember too. There's always, it pops up like every so often, this big, reaction to the fact that the Queen is buying up all this land in Colorado. Right? You ever hear that?
That one I did not hear.
Yeah, the Queen and what's his face, Ted Turner, are kind of land barons out in the Rocky Mountain West. But if that in fact is true, well, there you go. And here's another thing too to think about in the future. Eventually, you're going to be told we're running out of water. That's another control element to be used upon us. Can you imagine if you're being told that the land upon which you live does not provide you water along with the land? In other words, somebody owns the water underneath you.
The water rights, yeah.
And it gets even stranger, too, when you take a look at, and this is a really bad trend in the United States, which is making things much worse, just take a look at the example, and I know this is getting far afield, but take a look at the bottled water industry. I mean, how many times that's been bought out upon being consumed by another corporation, and now it goes to Nestle's. Nestle's in Switzerland owns like everything. The old Poland Springs, the old, what else was there? Deer Park water and all this other stuff that's out there. Zephyr Hills water. Huh?
I didn't know that.
Yeah. I mean, I had two coworkers, one in Jersey, one down here, whose spouses worked for bottled water. In Jersey, it was Great Bear. Then it became Poland Springs. Then it became Deer Park. And eventually, the company was closed down. It was streamlined. That particular individual was laid off for good. And down here in Florida, Zephyr Hills Water is now part of the Nestle family. And that spouse was transferred to Atlanta, or you don't have a job anymore. And, I mean, I even look at the supermarkets. The one I go to, you pass all the Lairships, it's owned by a Belgian firm. I mean, do we own anything anymore? U.S. companies are not U.S. companies. That's scary. But to be told also in time to come that we don't own the water and watch that thing happen. I mean, that's why supposedly the Bushes were so, aggressive in buying water rights down in South America, where all the good Nazis live.
Oh, wow.
It's bizarre. So, yeah, I mean, that's how strong those original documents and transactions were, that you could go back to the very beginning. And that's why some people got hit with, like, these absolutely arcane taxes and such that had never been paid and, like, rolled over for centuries. It's crazy.
Well, here is a specific, a Montgomery excerpt that specifically confirms what you just said, that the stupid patriot, you can't really own the land. You never had the land. All right. Montgomery writes, patriots claim they have allodial title to the land. How can this be when they never owned it to begin with? And then Montgomery cites this court case, Marshall versus Lovelace, 1 North Carolina 412-1801, 2SA70. Now here's the quote from that court case. But this state had no title to the territory prior to the title of the King of Britain and his subjects, nor did it ever claim as Lord Paramount to them. This state was not the original grantor to them, nor did they ever hold by any kind of tenure under the state, or owe it any allegiance or other duties to which an escheat is annexed, how then can it be said that the lands in this case naturally result back by a kind of reversion to this state, to a source from whence it never issued, and from tenants who never held under it? And then Montgomery concludes, the world continues to pay the benefactors of the king's charters for the king's investment in America via taxes.
Bingo. Okay, I have nothing to say, so if you want to go on.
Okay. Now there's another personage that we can't leave off here. This is from the chapter. First of all, this again is from the book The United States is Still a British Colony by James Montgomery. This is the chapter entitled A King's Charter Which Refuses to Die. You're going to get a kick out of this. The king is still head of America Incorporated, the author of its charters, and the creator of his Sestui K Trust. The king continues to be the benefactor, along with his heirs and successors, of the largest corporation in the history of the world. Now get this. The Pope, as well, is co-benefactor with the king, thanks to the king's concessions of May 15th, 1213, to the Pope. What he's talking about there is, in 1213, King John of Britain at the time gave all of Britain over to the Pope at that time. And so that makes the Magna Carta, which was came along a year or two after that, made the Magna Carta not even worth the paper it was written on.
Yeah, it vitiated it. Yep.
Yep. So let's see. A couple of pages later, Montgomery continues. Notice also, folks, this is just 1 year before the 1783 Treaty of Peace is signed. The King of France, backed by the Rothschilds, made sure his debt was protected before he signed on to the con of the millennium. The King of England's charter on one side, the French Rothschilds' debt obligations on the other, both vying for a piece of America. The King of England for his trust, and the Rothschilds for their corporate takeover and control of the King's trust, and the Pope as the main benefactor of both sides. The Pope remains even further in the background than the Rothschilds. However, he stands to gain no matter what happens. So this is kind of, you remember when you read Dark Union by Guttridge and the other professor?
And Neff, yes.
And Neff. They talked about intricate, secret banking deals underlying the Civil War in America that almost nobody knows about. But, of course, that old saying, follow the money. Everybody knows it's always about the money ultimately, but they don't take it, they don't do the homework and find out, really what history is about, what it tells us. When you have a war, there's always money, deep and powerful money interests that are really behind the war and stand to gain by it. One more excerpt along the same line from Montgomery. And I'm skipping a couple of pages here. Do the king and the Pope have proper claims to their land holdings? No. The king's claim would not exist except for his barristers, i.e. lawyers, and his backers, the bankers, and the Pope, via his church's land holdings and the financial backing of the early banking families. The reason I, James Montgomery, also say no is that fraud and deception are involved here. How did the king come by his claim? By the conquest of Britain by William the Conqueror in 1066, and thanks to the Pope's partnership with England as trustee for Rome, working inside of Britain with her Jesuit priests. Remember, this is my aside here. Remember, King George in the Treaty of Peace declared himself, along with some of his other titles, to be the elector of the Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Okay, getting back to Montgomery. Conquest does not change land held in trust. So the lands held by the British and trusts, that is, wills of testament, and traditions of the father's land going to the sons could not be overturned by the conquest of William the Conqueror. But even further than that, God Almighty granted to Adam and his descendants the entire earth. It was given away to Satan, but later reclaimed by Jesus Christ as the second Adam. The land was then placed in trust for the descendants of Israel. To deny this trust and charter is to deny the written word of God Almighty. If the Pope denied this, he would expose himself as the apostate church, the whore spoken of in Revelations. Why do I say this, Montgomery asks? Because he, the Pope, and the King hold lands by the King's civil law through creations of trusts and charters over land they do not really own, for they cannot. God Almighty owns the land and grants the land to whom he chooses, Israel. Just as the king held on to his possessions after the Revolutionary War for his heirs and successors, and just as conquest does not change ownership of lands and possessions held in trust, we now have the same claim. The fraud is the king is taxing us for a trust he created based on an earlier conquest. Now,
all right, listen, before, to cut all through that, let me ask you, to what or whom is Montgomery referring when he uses the term Israel?
Well, I left a little bit of that out.
That's all right. Again, you got to watch what you get into because, and I'm not chiding you at all, it's just that, yes, this thing is not easy to go through because if it were, more people would be aware of it and it'd be a lot easier to explain. Most people quit.
Montgomery includes a little excerpt, I left that out, about the 10 lost tribes. He doesn't really explain that, but
right.
That could be spiritual tribes, or probably more likely he might ascribe to the
racial tribes.
Yeah,
okay.
Which that opens up that. Of course, could be a subject for many other shows. So,
which we're not going to do.
No. But the point is that the king and the Pope, king and queen and the Pope, they are holding land and lording it over people when in reality God created the land, and it's God's to give away, not some human to wrest control of it and lord it over others. And then someday that is going to be rectified.
Also, the way that the Pope plays into this is that, at least in the Vatican's eyes, in the papacy's eyes, they are the ones who are entrusted with all that God could give. Let's put it that way. There's more than just one document written by more than just one Pope, whether it's a bull or not, that states that everything belongs to the Holy See.
Yeah, there's never been a more rapacious organization created ever.
But that's what lay claim to all that, and that is because they are the ones that it evolved upon from God. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. That's their take, and that's been very much stated all through the centuries by the Pope. That's all I'm trying to make that connection, because people who aren't necessarily Christians or Jews or whatever, I mean, most people don't believe in anything anyway, but understand that that's where the Pope is coming from, and understand that the papacy and the Vatican to this day, as a secular entity as well, as the head of the church, hold sway. I mean, it's a player. They don't want it's a player, but it's a player. So I just, again, that's another whole thing. But as you mentioned, those things that people are scratching their heads going, these wacko Christians. No, not at all. I mean, we're just telling you that that's where, for lack of better terms, which I'm obviously struggling for, the Pope lays claim as the vicar of Christ. There you go.
I want to, before we wrap this up, I want to get in this one paragraph, Al, because people out there who are going to have the knee-jerk, purely emotional reaction and say all of this is baloney because it doesn't fit the paradigm that they were, the programming that they were given.
Go ahead, and we'll go out on that because the time is growing late. Go ahead.
Got it. You know, this guy Montgomery and the second witness we could refer to, the informer, they've done, as you say, they've done the wet work. They've actually done the years of research. And you guys can go, naysayers can go check this out, can go try to refute this. But they deal with specific facts here. Now, this paragraph here just blows me away. I don't know how I would ever find the time to confirm or refute this, but I would invite naysayers, people who don't believe Montgomery, go check it out. Go try to refute him. And it is this. Montgomery has a paragraph here where he tells you how our taxes today, to this very day, through our IRS Tax 40 Form 1040, how a portion of that, to this day, goes to the king and the crown of Britain. And that's always been the case ever since the con job of the 1787 Constitution frame-up. Check out the specific facts and form numbers he cites here. Here's the paragraph. All right. He writes, IRS collected tribute. As further evidence, not that any is needed, that a percentage of taxes that are paid are to enrich the King and Queen of England. For those that study Title 26, you will recognize IMF, which means Individual Master File, and all taxpayers have one. To read one, you have to be able to break their codes using File 6209, which is about 467 pages. On your IMF, you will find a blocking series, which tells you what type of tax you are paying. You will probably find a 300-399 blocking series, which 6209 says is reserved. You then look up the BMF 300-399, which is the business master file in 6209. You would have seen prior to 1991, this was US/UK tax claims, non-refile DLN, meaning everyone is considered a business and involved in commerce, and you are being held liable for a tax via a treaty between the U.S. and the U.K. payable to the U.K. The form that is supposed to be used for this is Form 8288 FIRPTA, F-I-R-P-T-A, which stands for Foreign Investment Real Property Tax Account. You won't find many people using this form, just the 1040 form. The 8288 form can be found in the Law Enforcement Manual of the IRS Chapter 3. If you will check the OMB's paper, Office of Management and Budget, in the Department of Treasury, List of Active Information Collections, approved under Paperwork Reduction Act, you will find this form under OMB number 1545-0902, which says U.S. withholding tax return for dispositions by foreign persons of U.S. real property interests - statement of withholding on dispositions by foreign persons of U.S. Form number 8288, number 8288A. These codes have since been changed to read as follows: IMF 300-309, barred assessment CP55, generated valid for MFT-30, which is the code for the 1040 form. IMF 310-399 reserved, the BMF 300-309 reads the same as IMF 300-309. BMF 390-399 reads U.S./UK tax treaty claims. The long and short of it is nothing changed. The government just made it plainer. The 1040 is the payment of a foreign tax to the King and Queen of England. We have been in financial servitude since the Treaty of 1783.
Right.
And folks, you can say whatever you want about Montgomery, but you cannot say the guy didn't do his homework. You try making sense of that labyrinth. You go check it out yourself.
Hey, hose yourself off, will you?
No, because I know there's going to be a lot of people out there who just, they're going to poo-poo it, and, that's going to be folly and shame unto you.
Well, look, whatever one does not want to believe, despite the fact that it's true, has never stopped anyone from peeing all over it. Don't worry about it. It comes with the territory. We should have gotten used to it by now.